Okay, so this user comments that polls were correct. Hillary would have won in 2016, and honestly, well, it's not that the polls were incorrect. It's that our interpretation and use of them wasn't as good as it needed to be. Okay, and let's take polls count heads, right? And you have a whole bunch of national polls, and they are saying what the likelihood of people going to vote is. And in fact, the polls, the vote, what the polls indicated voters would do is what they did. If you look at the popular count, right, the popular count of votes was within the margin of error of the polls, right? So the polls were accurate there. However, that's not how we elect a president. And it comes down to state level polling. And you have to interpret those things. And it turns out that in 2016, there was some really bad state level polling, right? There were states that just had very few of them because the newspapers that used to pay, that traditionally paid for state level polling, had gone out. And so there was not much money being spent. We had bad state level polls. And that is something that they have corrected. Other people have moved in and, they are spending their money on that. But you have this big problem. And in fact, Nate Silver at the time said, going into it, he said, look, y'all, because a lot of people were making forecasts, and one guy said he'd eat a bug if Donald Trump got more than a few, he had a number. If he gets more than this many, I'll eat a bug. And of course, he did, right? Donald Trump did. The guy ate a chocolate covered. Yeah, that was bogus. Anyway, Nate Silver, not that guy, Nate Silver, he said at the time, hey, look, I'm looking at these polls. I see that Hillary Clinton is favored to win, but I don't see it's not that strong. And in our probabilistic analysis, if we take into account randomness, we take in possible variations. In our model, Trump wins 40% of the time. Hillary, 4 out of 10 times, Donald Trump will win. 6 out of 10, Hillary. Not a big difference, right? 60-40. And, the point too is, well, what happened, right? On that day, the number of people that decided the election, right, is under 100,000. I think it's like 50,000. Different. I don't have the exact number handy, but it's under 100,000 people changing their mind in critical states, right, would have thrown it the other way. So that's where this randomness comes in. And, what about Mueller reopening his investigation? You remember that? Do you think that might have had an effect on a 0.001% of the voters, right? I mean, small differences in an even election make all the difference. And that is why polls are very challenged nowadays. They're not picking up. There's not a big difference, right? We got a dead heat. The elections are very close, right? And that is, there's not an answer to detect, right? It's going to come down to how many people turn out, who turns out, who doesn't turn out. And polls are having trouble catching that. And, if you think polls are doing bad now, the polls showed that Carter was going to win versus Reagan, right? Going into that election in 1980, which I was too young to vote for. I was able to vote in the next election. In that election with Carter versus Reagan, they all, the polls kind of showed Carter in the lead, but there was this big undecided number. And over the weekend, the last polls were done, voters broke heavy for Reagan. So, the 2016 voting mishap is not in any way, they actually did a better job predicting the outcome than the polls back in 1980. So just keep that in mind. And so in our next Boring AF Politics podcast, we're going to talk about polls because, as you probably know, I don't know who's still here, but this is Boring AF. It's right on brand for me. But we are going to have that podcast and, follow, comment, do all that good stuff. But if you want to go to sleep